This is the last of our three major topics, and so many organizations want to apply data visualization to advance their business plan. So in this topic, I want to increase our understanding of how to create powerful data visualization. We know this task is not easy or obvious. We've all sat through unreadable, confusing, boring, or even misleading presentations with their associated charts. Today, we'll talk about how to make those charts more powerful by communicating their message better. So here's the outline. We have some learning objectives we'll talk about. We have, we'll attack powerful data visualization using these four subtopics: understand, create, refine, and practice and present visualizations, and we'll end up, as usual, with some recommendations. A lot of this is material that you're going to hear in the next half hour or so is derived from this book called Good Charts that comes from Harvard Business Review. So the point is that we're a bit aware of the vast data visualization choices out there in the world. And our challenge then is to design, refine, and present visualizations that best fit the data and best reinforce the message we want to convey. We want to accurately communicate the data. We don't want to mislead. We want to be persuasive because we're typically pitching some recommendation. We don't want to oversell or misrepresent. We want to be memorable and powerful to leave a lasting impression on our audience. We don't want to be boring. So this presentation will help us with those goals. We want to understand design considerations that lead to powerful data visualizations. We want to understand effective techniques to create data visualizations, and we want to understand best practice tips for presenting those data visualizations. So we'll start with understand visualizations and a very brief history of this work, and then we'll talk a little bit about physiology, actually, about what actually happens when the chart hits our eyes. So this all started way back in 1786 with the first publication that showed modern line charts, bar charts, and timelines. And then we see this infographic, the first ever infographic created by Charles Minard in 1861, and it illustrates how the army of Napoleon, as it marched towards Moscow and then its retreat, and how many people were wiped out along the way. It's a wonderful, powerful story on a single sheet of paper. Then we had Mary Eleanor Spear, who gave a lot of common sense guidance and invented the box plot that you see illustrated at right. And then we have Jacques Bertin, who created these 7 variables that lead to effective visualization, and these 4 are the most important. And then we have Edward Tufte, who emphasized minimalist design principles, and you'll see a lot of what I suggest today will be based on his thinking about excellent data visualization. And then we have Jack Macaulay, who added motion to all of this, and he was the leading light, or is the leading light, behind the development of Tableau, the software package. Okay, so what actually happens when the chart hits our eyes, or more precisely, when the light from a chart hits our eyes? Understanding the physiology of how light interacts with our eyes and brains is important to creating powerful data visualization. So what happens? Visualizations aren't read in a predictable, linear way. What happens, our eyes bounce around and we move from whatever attracts our attention. And we have to understand this issue to design good charts. What we see first what stands out. So therefore, we want to make sure that whatever stands out should support the main idea that we are trying to communicate to our audience. So we see only a few visuals at once. So something that's as complicated and overwhelming as this image is actually a total waste of time and generates nothing but confusion. We seek meaning and try to make connections. So we need to relate the visual elements in a meaningful way. You notice how color, size, shading, and position do that in this particular visualization. We rely on conventions and metaphors. For example, we have agreed that north will be at the top of charts and south will be at the bottom. And generally, we want to show time from left to right as an example. Here's an example chart. There's good use of simple color here, lots of white space for clarity, use of shading to highlight the problem. A few horizontal dotted lines makes it easy to see the numeric values. Excellent title, source of the data is shown. Now, however, there's too much text on the chart. Instead, we should place the text in the notes pages or to become part of what we say, not what we show. The y-axis here starts well above 0. That's often creates a misleading chart because it makes the values look bigger than they really are. In this case, the y-axis exaggerates the deficit. The x-axis numbers are ambiguous. The chart designer left off the 2 leading digits of the years. Instead, stretch the chart horizontally and show 4-digit years. And all caps tend to scream, and we're better off to use upper and lowercase letters. Okay, how do they handle it in Dilbert land? Do you want me to put the chart on one page, which would make the text too small for your audience to see, or do you prefer a multiple page approach that's confusing and unpersuasive? It's probably better if no one can read it. I won't bother using real world words, I'll just use gibberish. As we know, Dilbert tends to be immersed in horribly dysfunctional situations. Often Dilbert cartoons give the impression that the alternatives presented are the exhaustive list. That's never true. There are always multiple credible alternatives to address visualization problems, trade-offs, and dilemmas. Okay, let's talk about how we create visualizations. What visualization communication do you want to create? And how do you create them? We're going to share a technique for doing that in less than an hour because everybody's always under time pressure. So what do we want to create? Typically at the beginning, we're not sure of what kind of visual communication we want to create. If we're uncertain, we may have some ideas. We're not sure what might be best. So here are 2 questions that you could always ask yourself. First, is my information informational? Is my information conceptual or data-driven? Conceptual is qualitative, data-driven is quantitative. So that creates one axis. And the other question we ask ourselves, are my visuals meant to be declarative or exploratory? Declarative is to make a statement. Exploratory is to look for new ideas. So that creates the other axes. So the answers to these 2 questions lead to every consultant's favorite chart, the 4-quadrant chart. Now, so here are the axes that we just talked about, or the ends of the axes. And that leads to, if we're in this quadrant, that leads to idea illustrations. That's illustrated by this particular type of chart. Then there's the idea generation. This is the proverbial napkin in a restaurant. And then we have data visualization, which is what we're going to talk about most of the time here today. And then we have visual discovery. So 99, maybe even 100% of all data visualizations fall into these 4 categories. And you should easily be able to ask yourself or answer the question of where does your current problem fit? It fits in one of these 4 quadrants. So now we're going to talk about Oops. These 4 steps: preparation, talk and listen, sketch, and prototype. So here's preparation. We create a workspace. We put aside their data. So we think it's very important when you create visualizations is to not talk about the data. Ignore that. We tend to introduce the data into the discussion much too early because that's where we're familiar. And then we write down some basics. Who's my audience and what is the setting? So for example, the audience is the customers, management, technical staff, newbies. What's the setting? Auditorium, large or small conference room, video conference. What's the approximate number of participants that I'm dealing with? And then the next thing that we do is we enlist a colleague to collaborate a little bit. We write down words and phrases and statements. And then we match the keywords we just written down to various chart types, and we start to sketch. And we try out multiple visuals. And if we're not sure what visualizations might be best for the data that we have, here's a list that will help you decide what type of chart that you should be using. And if you need help with that, then there are these decision trees out on the web that will help you with that. And here's the link to 2 different web pages that will help you with the selection of your data visualization. Once you've done that, you start to prototype your approach with various sketches. For example, something like this, or something like this. So let's look at how good or bad this chart is. Some positive comments. It's a great chart that tells the story of how Canada's economy is starting to recover from the pandemic. It's concise, large, bold title. The subtitle describes some detail. Most of the area is devoted to the data. Horizontal histograms tell the story because there's lots of room for text on the left. The data is visually clear. We associate left with negative and right with positive, and you can see that's happening here. So now some criticisms. There's no highlighting of this line that's really quite different from the other data point. So we should do that. So how else could we improve this chart? We could remove these industry codes. Most people aren't aware of them, and they're just clutter. If somebody really cares, maybe we should have a table of them as a separate slide. So in Dilbert land, how do they do it there? I don't have anything useful to say, so I made a pie chart. Ooh, it must be true because it's a pie. Gee, that worked well. I pledge my life and my fortune to the pie. Like all presenters, Dilbert wants to impress and persuade. Clearly, he's more successful than he planned. In that sense, I'm envious of his impact. Colorful, artistically well-conceived visualizations with limited facts can razzle-dazzle audiences. That reality should create serious introspection about ethical issues for the presenter. Whenever you're thinking about a pie chart, immediately ask yourself if another chart type would be more powerful. Okay, I noticed that we've managed to go over our time here. Steve, are you okay if we continue, or what time constraints are you working with?
No, I'm okay.
All right, let's finish this off then. Our next section is to refine visualizations. The goal is to confirm your design and remove extraneous data, graphics, and words. Here's a simple framework to guide our thinking. So we want to focus here on the design structure and hierarchy. So we want to include a title, subtitle, visual field, source element, and align these elements with each other. So we want to avoid too many elements. We want to avoid too many types of fonts. Then we want to focus here on design clarity and make the elements support each other, remove ambiguity, use conventions and metaphors, and avoid clutter like you see in this chart here on the right. And then we want to focus on design simplicity, show only what's needed, minimize the number of colors. And you can see how this decibel chart is much smoother and clearer than the previous ones. So continuing on, we want to simply making an accurate chart is not enough. We want to hone in on this main idea. It's always about convincing our audience to agree with us on something. This is very bad. It's a pie chart and it has a large avoidable legend. That doesn't work very well. Make sure that the main idea stands out. Use simple design techniques. Adjust what's around the main idea, manipulate variables that complement the main point, and eliminate distracting data. In this example, there's just way too much clutter. Okay, now are we about persuasion or about manipulation? If we truncate the y-axis, as was seen on the left, the data looks interesting. If we don't truncate the y-axis, the data is boring. So what this generally means is we're trying to chart the wrong variable. Perhaps another variable will be more persuasive in explaining what we're trying to do. Sometimes we have charts with double y-axes, one on each side, for different data sets that we're bringing together. And this is a bad idea if we're just trying to save space. This is a great idea if the two time series actually relate to each other and you can demonstrate strong causal relationships. Here's an excellent example of using double y-axes. You notice how the colors of the axes are related to the color associated with the data. That really improves communication. And using two different chart types for the two different time series contrasts the data in an excellent way. Now maps, we like to use maps. The problem with maps is that some regions are bigger than other regions, and as a result of that, they'll stand out more. And if that's what your message, fine, but sometimes that isn't your message, and then that creates a real problem in communicating. So here's an example of charting the wrong variable. Cumulative annual revenue looks like we're on track, but in reality, annual revenue, same data, shows an alarming trend in the wrong direction. So the first chart is clearly an attempt to mislead the audience. There's another one, coincidental correlation. This is the one time series is the total revenue generated by arcades, and the other is the number of computer science doctorates awarded in the USA. Well, notice how closely they correlate. There's no relationship between these two whatsoever. So we should avoid that. What we need to do is have something called strong causation. So here's an example of two time series inflation of interest rates, and we can tell a strong story around how they are in fact, there's a clear relationship between these two variables where there wasn't on the previous one. How do they do this in Dilbert land? As requested, I fit my presentation on one PowerPoint slide. That's never a requirement. I had to use all the white space, but I think it was worth it to fit everything on one page. It's actually only one bullet point, but it's a long one. As we observe yet again, Wally's embroiled in a ridiculous dysfunctional situation. There's no rule that a presentation must fit on one PowerPoint slide. There is a rule that we should not present too many PowerPoint slides. There is a rule that we should not dense pack text onto slides. There's a best practice that white space is valuable for effective communication. There are always multiple credible ways to develop presentations with visualizations that engage and excite the audience and lead to commitment of the recommendation. Wally's ideas, as always, are not credible and born of misunderstanding. Okay, we need to practice and to present our visualizations. Let's talk about that for a minute. Always show this chart and stop talking. Give the audience a chance to absorb what you have going on. I'm really impressed by what CNN did in their election coverage and the visualizations of that data. I wish I had tools like that. Talk about the ideas of the chart. Don't talk about how the chart is organized. Give the audience some guidance if you have an unusual visual form that you think is effective. Use reference charts that provide some context. And turn off your chart when you have something important to say, simply by pressing B in PowerPoint and then again to return to the presentation. That moves the audience's attention from the visualization to you. Okay, keep it simple. Show something simple like this chart here. Create tension. You can often do that with motion or animation like you see here. Use time as a variable. This shows animation. Excellent vehicle. Zoom in or out in your presentation, in your data. That can really keep the audience's attention and make your point a very powerful one. Drill into the data, drill down, tell stories around the data that help people understand what's going on. Here's a very minimalist approach. It often communicates best. This is ranking of carbon dioxide emissions by country. China is at the top, but notice as effective as this is, the downside here is it doesn't show how much China is above the United States, because the answer in terms of volume is that it's a lot. So every visualization is a matter of trade-offs. So here's a chart about the added value of graph databases in credit fraud detection. So here the subtitles are much too small. It's hard to see what's going on. There's no unit of measure on the y-axis. And these variables have horrible names. Nobody can understand what's going on. It turns out that this is the variable names. If they'd been presented horizontally like this would have been a much more effective chart. And the point is kind of lost here, because on the left it shows the analysis using only 4 variables, and on the right it shows the use of about 8 or 10 variables and how this is achievable using graph databases, and the message is totally lost by very poor visualizations. So back in the world of Gilbert, someone told me your presentation was confusing and unpersuasive. All right. Sometimes one person's inability to understand looks like another person's inability to explain. I don't understand what you said. See? What's wrong here is that it's your responsibility as a presenter to ensure that your audience understands your message. It's never the audience's fault when they don't understand your message. So what are the recommendations here? Well, to understand the visualization, which is one of our first learning objectives. So I invite you to enhance your understanding of data visualization by reading and exploring the vast available work on the web. Widen your familiarity with the incredible variety of visualizations you can view on software vendor galleries. And there's a big bibliography in the downloads page that will help you with that. Create visualizations, experiment in the design, focus on simplicity in the end. Never be satisfied with the first version you create. Always see how you can refine it. And you can see an example here of it's the same chart, just version 1 and version 2. And number 4, present and practice. This business of presenting to yourself in the bathroom out loud feels very silly, but it really does improve your performance as a presenter. So I hope you like those discussion, those recommendations. They'll lead to success. So some ideas to think about. What's the most common kind of visual communication? There are 4 types: the idea illustration, the idea generation, and the one that we use the most, the data visualization, is the most common. How elaborate should your data visualization be? And the answer is not at all elaborate. Simpler communication is better. What are some presentation tips? Show the chart, stop talking. Talk about your ideas, not the chart. Guide your audience through the visualization. Can you describe an opportunity to improve visualization in your immediate area? So think about reducing the number of reports and tables, or at least add some graphs to those reports. Introduce more visual comparators between periods. And can you describe an opportunity to improve your data visualization? There's always activity and variances that are good examples of that. Never trust summary statistics. This is called the datasaurus. This is actually a real data set and should remind us how easy it is to mislead people with the data that we have.